Good morning, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, depending on what time you find to actually listen to this podcast. I'm Shivam. With me in the studio is Tiffany To, who is an executive vice president and general manager of enterprise and platform at Atlassian. We're also joined by Igor, our very friendly coach, who's been helping us through these journeys over the last 1 year. Back to Tiffany. Tiffany is a seasoned tech executive with nearly 20 years of experience across companies such as Intel, VMware, and startups before joining Atlassian in the late 2019. She holds a BS in Computer Systems Engineering from Stanford and an MBA from Berkeley Haas. What I really appreciate about Tiffany is her honesty. She's open about what doesn't work, what failure can teach you, and why the most meaningful growth often looks messy while you're going through it, especially for women in tech. In this episode, we'll talk about what it truly means to lead through transformation. We'll get into how to help teams learn quickly, how to experiment responsibly, and how to name the fears that show up during change, and how to build leadership that holds up when everything is shifting and sometimes falling apart. Tiffany, thank you so much for being here. We are really glad to have you. To start with, talk to us about your journey, the arc of your career, and how did you get to your current position?
My career has definitely been non-linear. I know listening to many of your other episodes, you've had a lot of folks that are like season 20 years, 30 years at Google. And my career arc is very, very different. And I feel like I should maybe start back very early in my career because I think that'll give you a sense of kind of my personality and why I've made some of the choices. And then I'll get to where I am at Atlassian. So I grew up mostly in the Bay Area, immigrant parents, but my parents came to the US from Vietnam because of the war. And so this concept of like starting over, taking risks, taking chances, that was very ingrained in me very young. And I saw them without formal education, both of them, they were not high school educated, start lots of different careers, right? And be okay with taking risks. And so I think very early on in my brain as a little girl, it was like you have to take chances and some things work out and some things don't. It's not this magic linear path to get to your success goal. And so I think that combined with they made their way to Silicon Valley in the late 70s, back when Silicon Valley like had it's funny because Shivam now hardware is like the thing, but I feel like we've gone through this arc, right? Or it's like hardware and then it's been all software and then now we're back to hardware again. And so as a little girl, they were there when Silicon Valley needed a lot of labor to assemble chips and monitors and computers. And so both of my parents worked assembly lines. So my mother worked for Amdahl, assembling chips. My father helped run assembly lines at Convergent Technologies, getting computers built. And so I grew up with like computer parts at home. I thought that was very normal. You had your regular toys and then you had computer parts. And so for me, that combination of tech innovation, being around that, and then also hey, just try things. It really like motivated me to look at both software and hardware, which is why I ended up studying both of those at Stanford. And then I initially sought engineering, right? Like, okay, I'll go build things. But in my very first job, paid job as a software engineer, they told me, we don't think you're going to be a software engineer because I asked too many questions about so many things and was so talkative. And I think it was a little more, there's also a cultural difference because my first job was in Japan as a software engineer. And so they were like, maybe you should be over there on the business side because you like talk a lot, ask lots of questions, and you like the tech, but you seem to be interested in more than just building the tech. And so that's why I kind of then shifted my arc into like, okay, gosh, in school you learn just how to build the thing, but now, when you look at the rest of the world, it's like, well, who is it for, right? What do you charge for it? What do people do with it after they get your product? And so that brought me into this realm of product marketing, product management, thinking about startups, big companies. And so that's why if you look at my career arc, it looks more like what I think people characterize kindly now as the jungle gym, right? Which is like, I went with what do I not understand? What do I not know? And let me try that, right? And so I didn't have that, I think, fear of failing, I think, early on, just because seeing my, I knew you kind of had to take all these leaps. And we can go into it in a little more depth. But that eventually I made my way to my current role at Atlassian. And Shubham, this is how we met, collaborating on Jira. Most people know Atlassian for Jira. And I would say my job here, the mission is simple. My job is to help all our customers, over 300,000 of them, realize the potential of their teams building the best products and services possible and building tools and products to help them go and do that. In practice, I kind of have a dual sided job. One side of my job is leading platform. And so my teams build the platform that all the products sit on top of. So, like I said, everyone knows Jira for all the workflows that it drives in a digital company, but you also need security and governance and good performance and managing the data, all these things around that make that possible. And so one side of my role is ensuring that we build the strongest kind of world-class platform that enables all those capabilities for our customers. But the other side of my job is really interesting. And I feel like I wouldn't be doing that without that kind of circular, jungle gym career arc I had, which is I lead transformations for Atlassian. So these are company wide transformations. It's not just about delivering a technical product, but it's how do I enable the whole company to support more and more really big, complex enterprise customers like your employer, Shivam, get it not just on the technology side, but how do we work with them? How do we partner with them and engage with them? And then how do we build a better solution for our customer? So there's a system of work transformation that I lead, which is about, interestingly, bringing all the teams beyond the engineering teams into helping build the best products and services. Because one of the things we've learned over time with all these customers using our products is engineers are pivotal. They're building the core products, but without product leaders, designers, the teams like yours running all the products and tooling, you don't get a good end result for customers. And so being able to connect those teams together and connect their workflows into a system of work, that's another level transformation that requires, as you can imagine, not just building new features, but learning how to take different points of view from other functions. So it's a pretty fun job because I get to build cool stuff, but I spend a lot of time working with customers like you.
Fascinating. I think you touched upon the double whammy that I've called out in some of our episodes with an immigrant and a woman. That's quite the double whammy.
And you have to add eldest daughter too. Apparently, that's the triple.
Mm. I think I think you win this one because I'm the younger one. I can empathize with that syndrome as I talk to my sister every night. But yes, yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah, and then it's while you were growing up in the valley and seeing this evolution and standing where you stand now. Looking back, how do you think the role of women has evolved? And starting from your mother doing the job that she was doing to the point to where you are at. And I want to call out the fact that you actually lead ERG groups at Atlassian, the women groups at Atlassian. That's a fascinating aspect to your role as well. Tell us a little bit about how have you seen this journey of the role of women in the Silicon Valley and beyond, proudly in tech evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shivam, because I think I want to just say all the wonderful things, but I think the reality is I've seen progress on some fronts, but I've also been being open and honest, like disappointed with lack of progress on other fronts, right? And I think some of that shows up very clearly in, my career's 20, 30 plus years. I think I thought the numbers would be very different by this time. I thought, wow, there's going to be so many more women in all across all functions, engineering, product, etc. I thought there'd be more women leaders. And I feel like though we've gone from not being able to see anyone in those roles to now having some women in those roles, it doesn't feel like the numbers are there. But what I am very excited about, which I see in the ERG that I work on at Atlassian and very much in like a podcast like this, is that there's so many more representations of what women can be, right? And so there isn't one template for a career path or success or happiness for women in tech. And I think that is really exciting progress because I feel like early in my career is very much just you don't fit. And like, what do you do to make everyone else feel comfortable that you do fit, right? Because you're usually the only one. And even though those numbers haven't changed, I think people's understanding of what women bring to the table and how that makes for better products and better teams and better leadership means that people are much more open. So that means we don't have to conform as much. So that's been a learning process for me very personally and being able to guide kind of other leaders, right? And thinking even to, I have a daughter who's 11, right? And instead of being like, when I think about my mom, she was like, don't always be right. Like even if you have the right answer, don't always say it, and like make other people feel comfortable. That was her generation. Whereas now I'm like to my daughter, no, like if they're wrong, just say it, like say it loudly. And so that shift both culturally, but I think the environment has to be ready for that, right? And it has to be in a place where leaders want to hear women's points of view, and I think that's very important. So, and that's my honest answer. I want us to see the numbers go much higher, and I think efforts like this podcast help a lot because a lot of times I think what holds women back is feeling like they can raise their hand, and to raise their hand they have to feel that they're qualified and can go do that role. And if they feel like there's only like one pattern match for that, then they're not going to raise their hand. They're going to hesitate. And I see that a lot in our ERG. A lot of the topics that come up is like, well, how do I ensure that I'm ready to go take on this other role? And I'm like, people often aren't ready for the role. They raise their hand and then they go do it and they learn and they leverage resources around them. But I feel like that's a difference that I've seen a lot over time is more women are now feeling like they can raise their hand. But I would love to hear your point of view, Shibam. You've lived through this, and Igor as well. You coach so many people through this.
Yeah, I think the sentiment is similar. You see them, there are more of them, but there need to be even more of them. Especially in certain pockets. Engineering continues to be an area where I still see one woman amongst 18 sitting on a table, and I have a problem with that. The reality is they're not going to get the voice unless they are encouraged, they are asked, they are poked. They are not going to raise their hand. It
Hmm.
helps be a woman leader in engineering in today's day because when you see them on the table, then you say, "What do you think about it?" And usually that raises eyebrows. It's like, "Oh, there's another person in the room. Who is she asking?" I often enjoy that moment of like, "Yep, I'm there to take care of them. I know you didn't see them, but I did," and that itself living your purpose in a day. But you touched upon something which is important, and it's a topic that I think I've been unpacking, and Igor and I have talked about, and Tiffany in our pre-conversation we were talking about where people think, to your point, where there is an arc, right? You do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and then you get to being an executive vice president. And everybody we talk to says, well, that is nearly not how it really worked out, right? Like it's a jungle gym. And I've been playing with this analogy in my head of the pyramid, where when we talk about the pyramid, people think, oh, there is less air at the top. You mean you have a broad base of people who join the workforce, and then over time there are only few that make it to the top. Are you talking about that pyramid? And I want to squash that image of the pyramid and say, no, that's not the pyramid I'm talking about. The pyramid I'm talking about is of skills and experiences and interests. Is when you start right out of college, you're exposing yourself to a broad spectrum of problem statements, of technologies, of personality types, of leadership skills and leadership types, regions, right? I mean, you mentioned starting your job in Japan. I actually had an opportunity to work in China for some time. And it was one of my first jobs. And I was like, this is very different from how we operate in the US. And I had never worked in India. So when I went to India and saw some of the work styles, I was like, wow, thank goodness I never worked here because they would have thrown me out of the company on day one. So we expose ourselves to these broad spectrum of skills and interests. And over time, we hone them into what is it that we are good at? What is it that is good for the world? What is it that we bring that is actually good for the world? And where do we thrive? And building that pyramid is literally the only recipe I've come up with because people keep asking, and you're used to this, right? Like, so Tiffany, what is the recipe for success? And I'm toying with the idea of like, build your pyramid, start broad and hone in. Curious what your thoughts on that. And Igor, you've been in your coaching practice, I'm sure you come across this as well. So I would love to discuss this more with
Okay, I can kick off. I love this visual of that pyramid, Shivam, because I think I go back to my daughter and I go, well, what is her path for success? And going back to the immigrant upbringing, it was at that time, okay, well, my parents were not formally educated. So their big takeaway to me was we want you to learn and fail, but you need to get out of the blue collar piece, go get educated so you can be a engineer, right? And so that was like their singular path that they pushed me on. Not asking like, will that make you happy? Is that what you're meant to do? It was just, yeah, we know there's doctor, engineer, lawyer. Those are like the acceptable professions. And you like tech, so you go towards engineer. And with my daughter, I go, well, actually, I want her to realize her potential, which is find what makes her happy, but what will challenge her. And that's the conversation I have with her all the time. And so when I go back to your pyramid, how can anyone know what will bring them fulfillment unless they experiment, unless they try different things on, right? If they only take one path, like maybe there is, I'm sure some people are just like, yes, at birth and as a little kid, they're like, I was meant to be a piano virtuoso, and like, that's it. And you go, and that's amazing. And I love that for those people. But I think for most of us, we're exploring, right? And we try things on. But a lot of times, I think society puts this pressure on us to like make progress in the thing that we're doing. And that happens, I feel like, acutely in American culture. It's like, you can't just do the thing. You have to be like the best at that thing, right? It's like, and when we do that, sometimes you can take the joy out of it. It's like, well, what does that child even enjoy about that sport? You're just wanting them to be the best at it. Let's figure out what they actually like. And so the pyramid is applied to your career. I really love that, Shivam, because it means, hey, let's start with, I mean, you have some inkling of something in university. So you're like studying things you're interested in, but you often don't understand the ecosystem of what goes around that particular study. And just like me, I'm like, oh, I know how to like do the software engineering, the hardware engineering, but I don't know how to like design a product or think about the user or sell the thing, right? And so that's kind of what I took my career path on, was just, okay, well, let me learn about all of the important things around the thing that I learned in university. And that gave me exposure to not just those functions, but what I liked doing, which is I learned, and it did tie back to engineering. I really like understanding systems, but I needed to zoom and broaden the system from just learning system architecture, how to design the technical thing, to, well, that product sits in another system in that company. And then that product sits in another system when that company integrates it with other products. And then that sits into a larger market ecosystem. And I realized that's what I love and I'm interested in. And so if you look at a lot of the companies I've joined, I followed technology waves that disrupted systems, because that's when it gets interesting, right? So my career path, if you look at the companies, it's like 6K disrupted the whole system, and then enabled cloud, and then that disrupted the system. Now AI is disrupting the system. And that is so fascinating to me, because when the system gets disrupted, bottlenecks move to different places, as you very well know. And then you have to solve these bottlenecks in other creative different ways, right? And I realized you can apply that initial thinking that I loved in engineering, but do it in a different way as a leader, helping companies and helping vendors kind of build around those systems. So yeah, I
Absolutely.
really like the pyramid. I think what can be, like you said, when people first hear their pyramid, they're like, oh, they still go back to linear, right? Like it goes this way. But I think it's important to know you probably fill out pieces on that pyramid, up, down, and around. It's not necessarily one.
That's very true.
Yeah. What I also wanted to add to that opinion is also sometimes it feels like we are intentionally building that pyramid, but in reality, it's very chaotic. And in most cases, it's not even like a pyramid. It can be a very random shape, and it becomes obvious what it is only after we made some progress and then we look back. So it's very important to, on one side, to have a plan, but on the other side, to be adjustable, because sometimes things happen that we cannot predict. For example, Tiffany, you mentioned your parents had to move, right? And it wasn't their own choice. So sometimes we are building a pyramid in one place, and then
So
we
true.
need to adjust to the new circumstances. And what I think is actually really beautiful about your nonlinear career is that we can learn so much from your non-trivial experience. And I believe there were some things that you took from your past experience, and you had a chance to work at some amazing organizations, like a couple of, actually four different startups, Silicon Graphics in the very beginning, and seeing downfall of that company. Can you tell us, what did you take with you from your earlier chapters, and what did you intentionally leave behind?
Yeah, I love that, Igor, because it is true. Like when you go backwards, you can paint a really nice narrative. And when you go to someone's LinkedIn, it's always like a really nice story. But then underneath, the real learnings are often like they're totally hidden, right? From that. As you pointed out, like Silicon Graphics was one of my first companies. So coming out of university, I love technology, right? And I knew I wanted to learn more about all the different ecosystem pieces around the technology, but I didn't understand business at all in the business ecosystem. So I literally was like, hey, what are like the coolest products, I've worked on? And at Stanford, we actually did a lot of our projects on SGI hardware, right? So they provided hardware and I'm like, oh, these are amazing products. And so I ended up in my first product management role at SGI, right? And it's funny because people were like, oh, you were there at the worst time. There are people that were there during the heyday. I was there as they got to the point of being pretty much delisted. The stock went below $1. But when at the time, it felt horrible. It was like, oh my gosh, like this was really bad. It's funny. My advisor went to Google from Stanford, and many other classmates went to Google, and I'm like, I could have done that path and just gone to Google for 25 years. But I look back and I go, this career path and the things I learned are so uniquely me, because you wouldn't really understand a system well unless it breaks, right? And so at Silicon Graphics, I learned so much about what happens when a new technology wave hits and it totally breaks the system, right? All of their prowess was based on custom hardware, right? Like they were building amazing graphics hardware to power, media and entertainment for Jurassic Park. We were building these crazy high performance computing clusters to help NASA do their exploration. And so I was like, this is amazing, until x86 totally changed the business dynamics and the cost model. So I know that taught me more. Like I went to business school eventually to learn like some of the fundamentals, but that taught me so much more than taking a business school class, reading a case study and being like, oh, they should have known that, right? But it's like, no, you have to live through a company. They build a culture, and when you become a very large company and you win with one thing, it becomes very hard to pivot, because your culture is very much around crafting this one strength, right? And so that taught me, okay, you always have to zoom out and understand the bigger ecosystem and think about, when this technology innovation happens, how does that like bottleneck that now has been unblocked, how does that cascade to creating other potential issues in the system? And where does that go? And that's why from there, I ended up at Intel, because we were partnering with them at SGI to do optimization around the hardware. And that's where I realized, okay, at Intel, even though it was a very, very large company, and so I learned culturally, I don't want to be in a huge, huge, huge organization. So that was a personal like test and fail for me. It was like, okay, I don't want to be 100,000 plus size company. But I could see that the optimization they had to do in the hardware, even though now you had much cheaper compute, they had to now move that into the firmware, into virtualization, and get the optimization that way. And so then that's what led me to VMware. And so I was at VMware for 5.5 years. And I loved that, because at VMware, we had to really think about the whole ecosystem around making a virtual data center, right? And it's so interesting to me, like we were saying at the top, Shivam, it's like you follow that system, you start to build those pieces, and then the bottleneck moves somewhere else. And that's where I kept going. So I went VMware. Then I realized, oh, as I worked with customers, so much of their budget still went to storage. So they got all these benefits from our virtual data center, but 70% of their costs would be in storage. And you're like, well, that's not what a Google does, right? Like that's not what they're paying for. So then I joined some founders and went into like the startup arc of my career to kind of follow that through. But yeah, it's definitely all about systems for me. But those failures, to your point, Igor, they teach you more almost than the success, because when something goes well, you're not exactly sure which of the things made it go well. But when something fails, you spend a lot of time deeply understanding what actually broke, and you internalize that a lot better.
The two of us deeply experienced that very recently.
100%. Yes. And you learn that it's not always a technology problem. There's a lot of human and process involved in a lot of making these systems work.
Very true. That is very true.
You mentioned one very interesting topic, and I want to double click on that: breaking systems and disrupting industries. And I was actually very looking forward to ask you this question, because I think you've done something very amazing in your career. You haven't just built products, but you've helped invent whole categories, which sounds absolutely amazing to me. And you actually helped build multi-billion-dollar product categories. To give us, for our listeners, maybe a couple of examples of those multi-billion-dollar product categories, but what is something I really, really want to know, how you develop that view of the larger system across functions that allow you to actually build a new product category.
Yeah. Well, first I'll start with, it's definitely not me, myself, and I that is building new product categories. But I think what I've learned in this pattern of following these technology waves is, because they change the fundamental systems, people have to rethink what that system looks like, right? Just like AI now is like changing the infrastructure stack that has to go around all of these business workflows. And so the opportunity arises when there's some technology innovation that happens, but there's a very large kind of gap, I think, from the technology innovation happening, the raw new capability, and then how does that fit into a system? And I think part of what I've really enjoyed over my career is working with customers to translate backwards from what they're actually trying to do as a customer, right? They're running their own business, they have their business goals, and they have a set of objectives that they're going after. And so that translation layer between there's this amazing new technology to what is the thing that they would purchase or implement and use to transform their business, that is that work that enables a building of that new category. And I think that's important because otherwise it's just a raw technology. And we're seeing this now with AI where it's like the innovation is the LLMs. And so the first kind of instinct for many, many customers was, oh, I have to get an LLM and tune it myself or build my own LLM, right?
Right.
Started doing that, and people are still doing that. And then then it's because AI has happened so rapidly, there hasn't been enough time to break down for them, well, actually, what is the system? You have a system of work. You have workflows that are running. What would actually make this work better, right? How can AI be used within that system? And then it becomes much more of a workflow story. And then we saw the wave with agents, right? It's like, okay, well, not just the LLMs, it's what they can do, the actions through agents, and how do we fit those agents into workflows? So you can see the new categories that are being built right now. Those are actually the ways customers are going to adopt AI. But initially, it was very like, it's hard because you're just looking at that raw technology. And so through my career, following virtualization and then the category of use cases that we could use virtualization for, like virtual desktop infrastructure, virtual storage, right? And then moving into where you see Atlassian now, where we're helping customers kind of conceptualize an AI powered system of work. These categories are important because they translate the technology into something that the customer can apply their business processes to. And so I think of it as the marriage of bringing the solution point of view to the raw technology, right? It's not a new category for category's sake, but I think it's important to make it a category because it helps customers identify the attributes they should be looking for, right? So if I'm building AI infrastructure, what are the important attributes to think about? Because otherwise it becomes very hard to pick things, right? And we kind of see that happening right now. Customers are like, I don't know, I'm going to like try all the things, all the LMs, all the different agent platforms. I'm going to try everything. And that's not bad because you're going to get a lot of great experiments and learning from it. But I think over time, you want customers to be able to get a clear ROI for their investments. And to do that, I think having clear product categories to apply those solutions is good. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy that kind of system matchmaking of like, okay, how do we help the customer system plus the technology come together? You're going to need these new categories of tech and solution to do that.
Yeah, I think this space is so dynamic right now. The running joke in NVIDIA is that you can't even step out for lunch because when you come back, somebody's launched something new and you're like, oh no. So we are basically creating categories on the fly and we are experimenting at a rate that I don't think this industry has experimented. All of it is coming at a certain price because there is the attention deficit that we're all dealing with, right? Like, should I aggregate all my data in one place? Should I use AI native technology? Should I use AI within the products where I am? And it's just creating a little bit of a fatigue of where I take it. But the answer is experimentation. And that leads me to my next segment. And I know this is dear to your heart as well, is when you experiment, you need two things. You need courage and you need a safety net. In the economy that we are living in, while courage is still relatively easily found, not as often as we would like, but it is there, the safety net is sort of thinning because of just the bottom line that the companies need to meet. And we just had Amazon lay off another 16,000 resources. And in the world where experimentation is required, courage can be still found, but the safety net is thinning and thinning. How do you, as a leader, make sense of this? How do you place your bets? How do you train your team to place those bets and build the psychological safety for them to go try?
Yeah, that's the great observation, Shivam, because it is a technology and a human problem, right? It's not AI is just going to solve all the things. It's how will humans make use of them, and how do we learn how to do that in a rapid enough cycle with experimentation when we're also doing our daily jobs. And so it's like, adopt all the AI so you can do your job 10x faster, but we don't know exactly how to do that. So figure it out as you go as well, right? That is hard and scary, and every organization is going through it. I think I'm lucky to be in a company where there is a lot of focus on creating that safety net, that psychological safety for experimentation, because its heritage has been as a product-led growth company. So we know that like the best things require a lot of iteration and a lot of feedback from customers. And so there's some natural muscle for that. However, I will say every tech company, you have all these really, really smart people, right? Who always have all the answers. And so it can be very humbling to be like, oh, here's all this amazing tech, but you can't just sit down and get a download, because in the hour that you've done your download, to your example, Shom, something has changed and it's new, right? And so you actually have to lean into each other a lot more. You have to be sharing a lot. So I think what we're seeing work well in the organization is, first one, carving out time for enablement. So if people are like, I'm doing my job, I can't let anything drop, and I'm supposed to experiment with AI, I think that can be very, very stressful for people and for teams, right? And so we try to carve out very specific days where, hey, all of the team, we're all doing enablement. We're all learning to prototype with Replit, or we're all using these new tools for AI code gen. And so making that space where it's like, okay, we're all in learning mode. We're students again, which means you're not going to get it right. You're going to share things with each other. There's coaches to help them. I think that's important because it puts people back in the mode of like, you shouldn't already be at the finish line of exactly applying this in the 10x way to your job. You're in the learn the foundation, iterate, and figure it out, right? And so I think that's a very basic thing organizations should do, so that people are not feeling like they're expected to have the finished solution. I think that helps with the first wave of using AI, especially in a very individual way. How do I improve my own productivity? I'm experimenting and learning what makes sense for my role. Other product leaders on my team their workflow might look very different. So everyone's kind of figuring that out. That, I think, can tap out if you're just relying on everyone to just experiment organically, in the sense that that has a lot of value individually. But if you go to the next level and we think about AI empowering workflows between teams or between functions, then I think leaders have to be involved in that. I think they have to go, hey, what do we think our highest value workflows or use cases are in this organization? It's a hypothesis. Let's pick 3, and then let's work together to set up experiments on that, right? And I think that's important because there can be lack of psychological safety to go recreate processes that go between teams or across the company, how you plan as a company, right? So I think that requires senior leadership. And I think they should show up with the same curiosity and humility of, I don't know, like, I think it's these 3 workflows, but let's try it. Because that's exactly what we see in our customers. The ones that are successful, they are a little more, they go through that first wave of let's try all the things. But then what we see in the success pattern is then they're much more deliberate. They go, we think it's these 3 areas, right? Like one of the customers recently I chatted with, they're like, we've already really optimized our like developer work stream with AI, but we suspect that the feedback loop from customers translating to requirements that then become the next level of product, that we think is slow. So let's work on that process. And that's in multiple systems. So you need multiple leaders agreeing that they're going to do this AI experiment together, right? So so I think like TLDR is there's no perfect formula, but I think to your initial setup, there has to be a creation of psychological safety, because people are doing this on top of their jobs. Yes, to accelerate their jobs, but they also are doing it on top of their daily commitments, right?
Yeah, that's very true. One of the things I've done, I started it at Google, I've continued at NVIDIA, and I think it works, is just labeling your projects as like, this is an experiment. This is an incubation. This is my bread and butter. And it helps with the teams to also understand the relative priority. So bread and butter cannot be missed. I still need this particular migration to finish. Now, the experiment on top of it is that we're going to actually provide the entire support using AI. If we label it as an experiment, I've already created that safety net for them below and above me and said, well, this might just not work, but it's worth a try because the rewards might just outlive the risk that we are taking. And that labeling is something which people can experiment with.
That it's subtle but very important because you're signaling expectations very clearly to folks.
I think there's something here about what women leaders today, especially in roles where you are being asked to make these decisions, can do a little bit differently. I see that hesitation, and not to play the gender card here, but I think risk taking comes more naturally to men than women. Traditionally, I don't have data that I can prove whether this is true or false, but traditionally in meetings and teams, you'll notice, more brash decisions can sometimes come from men. And women are deliberately thinking in their minds, does it make sense? Should I calculate it against what would be the risk, and how will it impact my team in my next step? And that's where being a little bit more courageous will help, because intuitively we have the ideas, we have the thoughts, we have the plan to actually leap into this new age of AI and do work differently. But very fundamentally, we are not as not as comfortable leaning into risk. And doing that, given that the whole world is experimenting with the technology, actually could be an accelerator, not just for AI, but for women in leadership to say, hey, I tried. It was the right moment where the right thing to do was to just lean in. And I did, and it worked. So something to think about. Maybe there are these micro accelerators in the economy today that can help bring more representation, but bring more powerful decision making, which actually changes the organization's path, which women can lead more intuitively, just as they come.
I love that. I love that. And you're right. The research does show women are more risk averse. And I think that comes back to, what you asked earlier about, what progress we've made in the last few decades. Because women are still underrepresented, and this isn't just women, any underrepresented group, then you feel oftentimes you're there representing that whole group. And so you don't want to have the wrong answer, say the wrong thing. You want to have the best idea. So I think that's the extra psychological load that people carry when they feel like they're represented. It's not just Tiffany's idea, a bad idea, then am I making it worse for all of the who will want a seat at this table, right? And so I think what you're bringing up is AI and experimentation, because there are no perfect answers right now and everyone's having to fail to learn. It actually creates a uniquely conducive environment for women to start to put their voice out there. And I love that, because I think when you think about how organizations work and how to make them more effective and how exciting AI is, a lot of that work I see it, bringing teams together, empowering them. Women carry a higher percentage of that load naturally. It just happens because they tend to be more attuned to the group and the team, what's not working, what is working. They're always wanting to be more helpful and deliver 110%. And so it's interesting because they often understand the system of work in an organization in a unique way, sometimes better than some of their other counterparts. And so they're in a great position to redesign these systems with AI.
Very true. So on this topic, I want to my last question on failures, and then we'll wrap this. Is what's a failure that you were actually glad that it happened and it permanently upgraded your way of life and the way you lead?
Well, we went through the Silicon Graphics one. I will mention another one. I've done four startups, and I think startup and startup failure is a very unique experience that I feel like everyone should go through that experience, because I think it teaches you so much about learning loop that you can actually work through in a relatively fast pace, right? In a large company, things move very slowly, right? And so you can take bets, but they take years and years to play out. But in a startup, you can actually take risks and make bets and see what's going to happen very quickly. And when there's a failure, so out of my, 4 startups, there were some good exits, but there are ones where one of them, I won't name them, I think we spent $60 million of venture capital and it didn't go anywhere, right? But you learn so much about the dynamics of the technology, the market, the timing, the customer base, how you read signal, and yourself. I think that the most important thing you learn about is yourself. Like, you think you have certain strengths, But when you apply them in a startup, you're really, really tested. Like I thought I'm really good at gauging customer signal. That's what I do. I spend so much time talking to customers and I like can get it and I can calibrate the market. But it's very humbling when you're in a startup and you're trying to have a small number of signals and then extrapolate that to the timing of a whole market, right? And being able to get a product out to market and fit that signal. So yeah, I feel like those failures are ones where I wouldn't trade them for anything because I learned so much more about myself, my weaknesses, and my strengths as a leader. And I think it makes me a much higher empathy leader as you go into a large organization now and I'm working with so many customers building their own products and services, I'm able to understand those challenges much more acutely from those startup failures and successes.
I'm sure people listening are very inspired about your great insights on personal and professional growth. And I'm sure many of our listeners would like to try to mimic and try to get some knowledge and insights into those areas where you are so good at. And many of us would love to hear some of your recommendation on resources that helped you build your expertise. Maybe you could recommend some books or practices or maybe some courses that actually helped you build up your extensive knowledge in this area.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Igor. I really appreciate it. I feel like it's, being able to reflect on my career. When you're in it, you're like, I'm just stumbling through. And then you reflect back, you're like, oh, I can tell a really nice story now. But when you're in the middle of it, it just feels like you're stumbling through. So, first off, people need to understand, people get to a point in their career and it's never a planned path, as you said. Shivam and Igor at the top. But I think sounds corny, but you have to read your internal signals, what really brings you joy. And I think that when we're early in our career, we don't tap into that. We're very focused, especially high achievers, on what is succeeding, right? Like what gets the result? What is winning, right? Is the company winning? Am I winning, right? And I think it's not in isolation bad, but you can end up actually turning off your attunement to the signal of what is actually bringing you joy. And that's important because usually the thing that brings you joy taps into what your superpowers are. And I think if you can listen to that voice earlier, then you actually can be more selective about the risks and career choices that you make, right? To tap into that more. And I feel like I learned that much later. And so the things that have helped me the most have been having a coach. Like that's not something I really worked on until much later in my career because I thought, well, I know best, right? Like what's a coach going to be able to tell me? But a coach asks you the really hard questions that sometimes you don't want to answer, right? And so I think a lot of the work that has to be done is more internal work. We have so many resources that are available externally. So I won't mention the Million Tech podcasts, although one of my favorites is the Knowledge Project. My chief of staff and I listen to that one just ardently because I feel like they bring such really, really interesting stories and leaders onto there. But one of the books I'm reading right now that I love is from Brene Brown. I think a lot of people know her from Dare to Lead, and she's got one right now on Strong Ground. But she really dives into a lot of these internal leadership topics that I've felt, but I've had to work on with my executive coach, right? Being a leader, not having all the answers. Being vulnerable isn't weak, right? How to have really honest, hard conversations with your teams. These are all things that I feel like she unpacks really, really well. And I know she has a whole set of folks that go and lead workshops for teams. But my biggest advice is like spend some time on yourself actually, because there's a ton of things that you can find externally, but being able to spend time on figuring out what it is that you're really passionate about will help you, I think, design the right career. And then I think listen to podcasts like this, because I feel like part of it for women is just hearing lots of voices that are different that they can then kind of feel some affinity to. Because it's hard when you look at the media and the types of leaders that are covered, still underrepresented, as we said. Not a lot of women there. So they're not really seeing like that's the career path for me, right? And so being able to understand that there's so many other patterns for that. So thank you both for the work you guys do, bringing all of these stories to your audience.
Thank you for being part of our work. For our listeners who would like to follow you, who would like to keep in touch, and who would like to continue learning from your experience, what's the best way to connect with you? What's the best way to follow you and follow your work.
LinkedIn is the best way to connect with me. Yeah. Look forward to hearing from folks.
Tiffany, I've seen you in a professional setting for almost over a year now. I have to say that I saw through this persona in our first meeting. The authenticity that you bring across your personal and professional domain is very inspiring. So thank you so much for coming to the show, sharing your lovely stories, very real stories, and inspiring a ton of women out there and men, actually. We know we have enough men who listen to our podcast as well. Thank you so much for inspiring us all. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Shivam and Igor.